everyone to Watching the Hawks. I am Tyrell Ventura, and joining me today for our weekly panel discussion on the news of the week is the host of The World According to Jesse, former Minnesota Governor Jesse Ventura, author and editor-at-large for Salon.com, the one and only Dee Watkins, RT America correspondent Rachel Blevins, and RT America sports correspondent Stephen Christakos. And we got a full show for you. We go from war to New Year's Eve shootings to NBA commissioners. We've got a whole lot to get to, but first let's start with the recent protests and siege of the U.S. Embassy in Iraq. And look, almost immediately since the start of this, the U.S. spin machine jumped, led by President Trump, put all of the blame on the protests on Iran and Iranian-backed militias in Iraq. Let's get the big, huge, monstrous elephant out of the room, and let me ask this panel, are what we're seeing happening in Iraq right now harbingers of a potential war with Iran using Iraq as the battlefield? I'll start with you, Jesse.
Well, of course it is. You know, you have to look at it. The Congress just appropriated $850 billion to the Department of Defense, which should be called the Department of Offense. And they've got to have a way to spend all that money. Now, allegedly, they're trying to get us out of Afghanistan, but we're a war culture now. So we have to stay at war, so they have to develop a new war if there's not going to be one in Afghanistan. Now, I'll get political for a moment. If I were president, I would welcome that $850 billion to the Department of Defense. But rather than spending it on aircraft carriers and rockets and weapons of mass destruction, I would go out and spend $200 billion on those machines that clean up the ocean. Then I'd spend another $50 billion on training the United States Navy how to use them. And we would start a war on cleaning up the ocean. Guess what? The rest of the world might like us again. But what are the chances of that? No, of course. We're going to go to war again because the military-industrial complex has to spend that budget. They've got to spend it or lose it.
What do you guys feel? Should we be fighting the war on climate, or should we be fighting another war with Iran? Do you guys see a war with Iran coming down the pipe for 2020?
Well, it's interesting because it was just a few months ago that top U.S. officials like Mike Pompeo and then John Bolton were all saying, hey, watch out, Iran is going to use these smaller militias to go and attack U.S. troops. And they kept warning about that, even though Iran was saying, we don't have any plans to do this. And now all of a sudden you have a attack with a small militia that killed one, U.S. serviceman. And now all of a sudden they're going off, even though Iran is saying, hey, we didn't do this, it lines up with that narrative that they have in place. And so now they're able to say, oh, look at this. And of course, how dare these protesters come and storm this embassy and speak out in a country where the United States has invaded and has been for several years with no sign of leaving in the foreseeable future.
That's true.
It's a clear display of why we need new leadership. Like everything that Jesse said, just the whole idea of the military-industrial complex, war. There's a new war agenda every year, and it's been that way since this country began. And, it doesn't work for the people.
No, it doesn't. Steve, what you thinking on this?
I mean, well, we could talk about who this militia was, were they Iranian or just Iraqi people, and whether it was justified to bomb them or not. But at the end of the day, like Rachel said, we've been there since 2003 in Iraq, and unjustly. So eventually, people are going to rise up, and when the bully keeps on punching you down and kicking you, you're going to get punched back in the mouth. And I think that's what happened. And the U.S. is being a bully over there, and they're bound to get what they have coming to them.
It's interesting, too, because what you see happening, too, is, remember, no one was thankfully killed in the siege on the embassy. It was mostly just property destruction. They didn't even get into the actual part of the embassy where people were. I mean, one of the interesting things, too, that jumped out at me is the Iraqi security forces actually let these protesters into the green zone. Like, these were the security forces that we've been training for however many years we've been there. In response, then you also saw that in response to the original U.S. airstrikes that killed these 25 Iraqis. Now, they may have been in this supposedly Hezbollah-backed, this Iranian-backed militia group. There's still 25 Iraqis, right, that we killed. Iraq's Prime Minister, Adel Abdul Mahdi, stated, we have previously confirmed our rejection of any unilateral action by the coalition forces or any other coalition forces or any other forces inside Iraq, and we consider it as a violation of Iraqi sovereignty and a dangerous escalation that threatens the security of Iraq and the region. Are we seeing in real time the United States kind of lose its control over this country, that it toppled its government, like we said back in 2002, 2003? Are they losing control of this country? Jesse?
Tyrell, I'm still waiting for the day Dick Cheney told us we would be greeted in the streets like liberators. I'm still holding my breath. Let's get Dick Cheney out here and explain to us why it's nearly 20 years later and we're still not being looked at by liberators. You know, when your country goes out and they wage war simply for regime changes, this is the blowback you end up with. So everything that's happening now is the result of the misguided, lying war the Iraq War was, and that's all they do now is lie to get us into war. Now we've learned Afghanistan's been a big lie from start to finish. When are the people going to wake up to these lies and finally say no to the wars?
I don't think Dick Cheney has ever been greeted anywhere ever. He's not even. Dick Cheney doesn't get greeted in his own country, let alone somebody else's. It kind of also makes me feel like, and I know we've removed, but we've been too easy on the Bush administration. You know, and Trump comes in and it's just all goofy and out of control, and we kind of forget like those years. People don't talk about them enough.
Yeah, how much damage was wrought. Yeah.
Right, well, and imagine being a citizen in Iraq. You know, you had the United States come in, wage this war, and then all of a sudden it starts coming out that this weapons of mass destruction claim was all a big lie, and yet they're still there. There's no accountability for it, and the United States basically says, hey, guess what? We're camping out here, and if you try to do anything about it, then we're just going to come and launch more airstrikes in this country where we aren't even supposed to be in the first place. I mean, that has got to be incredibly frustrating.
Good point.
Yeah, no, I think, you know, we use the narrative as that ISIS is our biggest threat, and they're these big, scary boogeymen over there. But if I heard correctly, this militia was leading the fight against ISIS as well, and we're bombing the militia that is leading a fight against our biggest threat.
That's a great point. They actually were. They were one of the biggest.
Wait.
Yeah.
Hey, let's throw in there, too, there wouldn't be ISIS if we hadn't invaded Iraq in the first place. ISIS did not exist until we invaded Iraq. They're the leftover of Saddam's regime that we didn't pay or keep on the payroll when we got there. They went up north, reformed themselves. So ISIS is our Frankenstein.
It always has been. It's very interesting. Like, in response to the protests and the burning of the guard stand at the embassy, President Trump, in all of his glory, treated Iran will be held responsible for lives lost or damage incurred at any of our facilities. They will pay a very big price. This is not a warning. It is a threat. Happy New Year.
Yeah, this guy's crazy.
Should the he literally ended the tweet with Happy New Year.
This guy's crazy.
Should the U.S. president or any other elected representative or official from the United States, because this is very serious, be threatening nations or a nation's people or anyone whatsoever on social media? Should that be allowed at this point?
No, like, why am I announcing this on the internet? Like, what's the element of surprise? Like,
good point.
Are you 2 years old? Like, come on, man. Like, it's out of control. I think that, you know, in all fairness, I think the president should be kicked off of Twitter.
Oh, yeah. I'm surprised we haven't seen that yet.
And we live in a day and age, too, where what Trump tweets becomes headline news. And so as a result of that, the mainstream media takes it and they carry this narrative, right? All of a sudden they say, well, the president claims that Iran was behind these attacks. So now we have to go forward and spread that claim and spread that claim. And it's one of those things where Iran has said they weren't behind them. So if it's a lie that's spread enough times, then it eventually becomes the truth. And regular Americans sitting at home are watching this on Fox News or CNN, and they're like, well, they said Iran is after us and they're killing our soldiers. So now we have to go after them.
Good point. Good point.
I'm just going to say that,
Ty.
you know, somebody... go
Hold
ahead.
on. Jesse's jumping in.
Last thing, let's remember, this is the Twitter of a draft-dodging coward. When it was time for this guy to serve, what did he do? He paid big money and got out of it. That's why he's a tough guy, because he himself never would ever fight himself. He'd hold your coat and let you fight.
Ooh, tough guy on Twitter, but not in real life.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Just an example of a bully who should not be a leader in any way, shape, or form, like at all. Because, like I said earlier, when eventually you're a big bad bully, you're going to get hit back in the mouth, and It's just a bunch of empty threats.
It is, and that is the danger I see in that kind of thing. It's like, look, I'm fine with you want to talk policy on Twitter, you want to tweet out what your ideas are for the country, you want to have that communication with your base directly and not have to go through the media. Fine, you can do all that, but we don't need to turn Twitter into like a 16-year-old war that I see in high school between countries. I mean, seeing then Iran's leader fire back at Donald and Donald fire back at that. I'm tired of it. I don't want to see it anymore. It's childish, like you said.
Unlike a lot of people who talk trash on the social media, his tweets matter.
Yeah, and I don't think we're going to see this.
His tweets matter. They have this real implications.
And until we get a president who doesn't own a cell phone or isn't on social media, I don't think we're going to see that end anytime soon.